Morning, everybody. Welcome to this seminar this morning. We're delighted to introduce our 5-part seminar series on neurodiversity within the workplace. This seminar series was born out of a series of Zoom and IRL in real life meetings between myself and our other speakers, all of whom have a passion for the development of a neurodiverse workforce. Our aim for this seminar series is to bring some clarity to the question of what is neurodiversity and to highlight how it can help an organisation. And we also hope to remove some of the perceived barriers that arise for employers when employing neurodiverse staff. We are recording the seminar, and if anybody wants to have a copy of the recording, please do email one of the speakers and ask for it, and we will get a recording to you together with a copy of the slides. So today we're going to look at what is neurodiversity and how it can benefit your organisation, and our subsequent seminars. Basically, if we could have the next slide, that sets out the titles of the further seminars and the dates of them. You'll see the sessions and the dates there. They're all at 2 p.m. apart from the session number 3, that's at midday, lifting the barriers and removing the fear. In terms of housekeeping issues, we hope we're going to speak for about 30 minutes. We might run on a bit and take questions for 15 minutes or so afterwards. You'll see that there is a question and answers box where we'd be really grateful if you could post your questions rather than in the chat function, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But we really want these sessions to spark debate and discussions, and we would really encourage everybody to make any observations or raise topics that they would like us to touch on in the following seminars, as well as raising any questions. Our speakers today are Gillian Burgess-Smith and Jack Fitzpatrick from Inclusive Environments. The speakers will introduce themselves separately, and also Liz Norman from E&I Recruitment Specialists. If we could go to my profile, Maisie, I think that's the next slide. Those are a list of speakers. Then the next slide is just a short introduction to me. I am a partner in Edwin Co LLP. We're based in Lincoln's Inn in central London. I head up the employment team, and I frequently act for individuals and companies who are navigating their rights and obligations under the Equality Act in relation to disability issues, which can obviously include neurodiverse issues also. My pronouns are she and her, and I just wanted to highlight some of my core values: honesty, transparency, and empathy. I'm going to hand over to Liz, who will introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Liz Norman. I am the founder of E&I, which is a recruitment consultancy specialising in the area of insight. I'm dyslexic, and I've faced barriers to entry when I was in my 20s. And so when I set up a recruitment company, it was always with inclusivity in mind and trying to enable all those that have the right talents to get the jobs that they deserve. My pronouns are she and her. And I guess the major values for me are being both collaborative and empathetic, both of which are essential in recruitment. And is it Gillian? Oh, Jack, I'll hand over to you.
Good morning. My name's Jack Fitzpatrick. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the co-founder of Inclusive Environments Limited. I'm a person with lived experience of autism and dyspraxia through a diagnosis since the age of 3. And I've just completed my BA Honours degree in Education Studies and Inclusion this week. I'm also identify as neurodiverse, and my values are honesty, integrity, and inclusivity. And I'll hand over to Gillian.
Thank you, Jack. So hi, I'm Gillian Burgess-Smith. My pronouns are she and her. By profession, I'm an architect, and the photo actually shows me at graduation in 1998, when I was the only female to complete the course through 7 years of day release. I spent most of my career with global architecture and design companies, including Pringle Brand and Perkins & Will and HOK, and I sort of specialise in workplace design and change engagement. I've often said if I wasn't an architect, I'd like to be a psychologist, as I'm really interested in the human experience and enabling people to reach their full potential. I'm also a Leesman approved practitioner, and as part of my training, I underwent a sort of a brain mapping. It's really a great HR tool, but it effectively looks at your underlying traits, so what you're doing if you're just going about your normal day, and your adaptive traits, so how you act on a day-to-day basis, and you really want to get these as close together as possible. And it was really drawing from that brain mapping and also reading this amazing book called Behind the Mask by Andre Funnell that I realized I should follow my authentic self and values. And my values are empathy. I think we all have empathy in common, understanding and creativity. My personal story is that in 2019, I actually had 2 strokes, one of which was actually in the office, and I was diagnosed with a rare incurable brain tumour. And it wasn't long before I was having different experiences within the built environment, and I realised that all through my life as an architect, we'd really been designing for people with visible disabilities and not invisible disabilities, and this really shifted my perspective. I've started with complementary research, and that's where I met Jack, and really sort of giving values to SMEs and other companies around neurodiversity. So I'm here today as a passionate advocate of the neurodiversity movement. And what I love about neurodiversity is that it also cuts across all the other protected characteristics. So age, gender reassignment, race, marital status, pregnancy, religion, belief, sex, and sexual orientation. For me, if you can think about our brains and that we are all different and get that right and create these environments where people can reach the full potential, you're actually doing something that benefits society. So it's a very long intro, but I'm very passionate about what I do. Next slide, please. So what is neurodiversity? So it simply means neuro, which is brain, and diverse, which is different, so brain different. Neurodiversity is not actually a name for a neurological disability, but it's actually a term that was coined by Judy Singer in 1998, so it's a fairly late term, and it moves away from that specific condition labels such as autism, dyspraxia, ADHD, etc. And instead it looks at those variations across the human brain. And it's really about valuing the contributions that neurodivergent people and experiences and what they can bring to organisations. Neurological profiles can actually be grouped in sort of 3 groupings as typical. So you have neurotypical, although if you'd have come on early, you'd have heard Linky and I talking about the fact we don't believe anyone is particularly neurotypical. We all have different brains and we're diverse. But if you're neurotypical, you're deemed as having the dominant cognitive way of functioning and thinking. And this covers what they assume is the majority of about 80% of people. Neurodivergent, which is sometimes abbreviated ND, and that really means having the style of neurocognitive functioning that diverges significantly from the dominant societal standards of what is normal or average. And ND individuals cannot be cured, but there are sort of therapies and support services that can help a person really improve their symptoms and quality of life. And the third one, which is where I'm sitting, which is neurodegenerative, whereby sensory and profile differences develop over time. So this would include also sort of Alzheimer's, brain tumours and other cognitive conditions, such as stroke or traumatic brain injury. When people are, I'm not an assessor, I'm not a professional assessor, but just to explain to you about when people actually assess for people with neurodiversity. So what they're actually looking for is statistical differences between our main cognitive skills. So firstly, that's verbal comprehension. So that's how we make use of the world using language. Secondly, our reasoning skill. So this is the ability to problem solve and make sense of visual and abstract information, often thought about as being sort of problem solving. And these two skills are really like our engine. They sort of act with what we do with the information once we've received it. Thirdly, you look at the working memory, which is almost that one-stop shop for new information. And it's also linked to our attention and our short-term memory stores. And finally, our executive function, which is our processing speed, which is how quickly we move between tasks. And human beings have this wonderful idea that we can actually multitask, but that's a complete fallacy. The human brain can't multitask, but what we can do is move between tasks very quickly, which actually helps us believe we're multitasking. Also, some information that we learn sort of stays with us on a sort of a low level. So if we're thinking about a neurotypical brain, we think about these four elements, and these four elements are roughly working at the same speed. What happens when you're neurodiverse or brain different is that across these four skills, there are significant differences. So in short, some professionals describe it with the analogy of speed. So if you imagine your four parts of the brain, it's like two or three of them are sometimes steaming ahead, and one of them might be sort of distracted or lagging behind. So each one of us is actually unique with our conditions, and neurodiversity and brain differences are as unique as fingerprints. And sometimes I think the language can be a bit of a challenge, but we're going to help you sort of look at those challenges today and try to sort of demyth some of the myths around neurodiversity. So if I could have the next slide, what I'd actually like to do is a poll to the audience. So you should see a poll come up on the screen, and just to remind you that any Q&A or any poll information is completely anonymous today. So if you could just vote, what I'm interested in understanding is, as an audience, how many of you are formally diagnosed? How many of you have been self-diagnosed? How many of you don't consider yourself neurodivergent, but identify with some traits of neurodiversity? How many of you consider yourself neurotypical? And obviously there's a sort of none of the above to capture those. I don't know, or I haven't really thought about it yet. So if we could get your votes, that would be fantastic. Are we starting to see the votes? Thank you very much. Really interesting. So actually, some of you, as I said, actually have been self-diagnosed as neurodivergent. It's interesting you haven't gone for the formal diagnosis. Many of you, 50% actually consider yourself neurodivergent, don't consider yourself, neurodivergent, but actually identify with some of the traits. And I think that's quite common. And then 25% of you are neurotypical, and others are sort of on the fence at the moment. They need to probably understand it a little bit more. So thank you very much for that. If we could go on to the next slide. So what you're going to see on the next slide is some statistics around individuals. 1 in 7 are estimated as being neurodiverse, although I think because of those that haven't been diagnosed, are self-diagnosed, etc., actually that's probably higher. But as you look at the statistics, I'm actually going to read you an extract from a blog of Catherine Bean, who's actually a researcher at the Office for National Statistics. And she says, "You probably can't tell by looking at me, but my brain works very differently to yours. Like around 700,000 people in the UK, I'm autistic. This isn't an apology or an explanation for my faults. I'm proud to be autistic. I think that autism makes me a strong analyst and an asset to teams I've worked in. I love coding and problem solving." Actually, Liz and I spoke about that again before we started this conversation, and I'm good at it too. I feel very fortunate to work in the civil service and proud of the encouragement I've had here as an autistic person to succeed in my career. The working world supports neurotypical people by default, and often neurodivergent people are left to advocate on our own behalf to get reasonable adjustments. Without good support, neurodivergent people like me may not progress in our organisations and may leave jobs altogether. As an analyst, I spend a lot of my day working at the screen. Inclusive technology is vital. Specialised technology to adjust for different ways of reading is incredibly useful, like colour filters for screens. Crucially, managers shouldn't feel unable to talk about neurodiversity. I think this is the message we're trying to get across today. And when conversations are initiated by managers about working more inclusively, the burden is actually taken off these individuals, and employers may not previously have known the full extent of resources available to them. So I think it's important for HRs and managers and leadership within organisations to really be proactive, and part of that is you attending this seminar today, so we're grateful for that, in helping sort of teams and individuals to succeed. And now I'm going to hand over to Jack. Jack and I are co-founders. We have very different backgrounds and, as you can probably tell, ages, but we complement each other. And Jack also lives through this lived experience. So Jack, over to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So about making diverse minds matter. So the barriers and some statistics associated with this. So there's a 10% rise in the employment rate of disabled people would increase, if there is a 10% rise in employment of disabled people, this would increase GDP by £35 billion by 2035. However, there are some challenges here. 2 out of 3 employers believe that there are significant barriers to employing people with learning disabilities and autism. Only 9% of employees believe that there is a good business case for taking on young people with learning disabilities and autism, and 65% of individuals do not disclose in order to avoid discrimination during selection. 49% of individuals that disclosed during selection regretted disclosing it, and only 25% of employers know about support from Access to Work. However, there are some significant success stories, such as the Vice Admiral Nick Hine, who's head of the Royal Navy, Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, and the bottom face is Gillian's autistic nephew. He is brilliant at maths and on the stage, but he finds social conversations difficult, or find an interview difficult, as he finds it challenging to look people in the eye, which is something, however, I have been taught through coping strategies over many years to directly look people in the eye when I'm speaking to them. It shows the range that neurodiversity can cover the spectrum. And each person has a unique picture of strengths and challenges that can change over time. Next slide, please. So the challenges of diverse minds. So neurodiversity covers dyscalculia, dyslexia, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, including autism syndrome, and dyspraxia, DCD. So within this, there are a variety of, for me, being autistic, there are a variety of autism spectrum conditions, including autism and Asperger's. Different individuals have different challenges and strengths, and not one person is similar to another. There is a saying, when you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Autism was described as a unique disorder in the 1940s and included only those children who displayed symptoms of what might be described today as severe or level 3 autism spectrum disorder. ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and Tourette's are all examples of neurodiverse conditions. The diagnostic labels used to explain the diverse ways of thinking, learning, processing, and behaving. Often people that are neurodivergent have more than one condition. As I mentioned, I have autism and dyspraxia. As with all people, we all have our talents and challenges. Next slide, please. So these are the business case benefits and positives with these different conditions. For instance, with dyslexia, there's visual thinking, imaginative constructs, and 3D mechanical skills. For dyscalculia, there's verbal skills, innovative thinking. And for dyspraxia, there's verbal skills, lateral thinkers, and they're intuitive. For autism as well, It's high concentration, fine detail processing, and good memory recall. Often we hear about the challenges, but many neurodiverse people with autism and dyslexia have extraordinary skills, including those in pattern recognition, memory, and maths. And this brings a huge business benefit to many organizations. Through diversity of thought, creativity, and innovation, our research looks into detail at the creative processes that people have. Lateral thinking, strategic analysis, bringing a different perspective, development of highly specialized skills, consistency and accuracy of tasks once masters, and also staff retention within businesses. Once people are in there, they can excel within that inclusive environment. Yet often they struggle to fit the profiles sought by employers. My own personal skills that I feel are my strengths include empathy for others, informed by lived experience, effective communication, both written and verbal, good work ethic. When tasked with something, I will do it to the best of my ability and finish it, and make the best of any opportunities that arise, as well as working independently and as part of a team to effectively. So I'm now going to hand back to Gillian for our second poll. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. I can definitely attest to your abilities and strengths, and I know that they certainly complement my own sort of weaknesses when it comes to finishing tasks. Sometimes I can go off on a tangent and be quite creative. So the slide that you see on the screen at the moment actually sort of shows your organisation as a sort of a maturity model. So essentially, what we'd like to do is just a second poll to understand where your organisation is. So is your organisation at where we're sort of calling one, which is this maintaining, what do we need to do? What are the basics that we need to do to stay out of trouble? It's really that sort of box ticking exercise. Is it sort of along that too, where it's actually thinking about, what are the most immediate areas? So this is, we've ticked the boxes, but what areas can we actually put into projects and actually sort of focus on? So this might be adaptations for people with physical disabilities. It might be putting in mothers' rooms, sensory rooms, etc. So where you're starting to create some of sort of solving some of these issues. The third area is really, how do we support our diverse workforce? So it's creating a broader range of solutions that might include health and wellbeing ambassadors, DEI considerations, skill sets, so sort of training people, etc. And then from that transition point, this is where actually we go from the mandated into that sort of the movement, going to more mature. So number 4 is essentially, we're really thinking in advance about how we can deliberately create environments that enable everybody to reach their full potential and do their best work. And this comes from sort of top down and bottom up. Or are you at the end of the scale where it's sort of leveraging? So how do we drive this diversity through our employees, through our customers and our clients to really be thought leaders in this field? So if we could have the poll up on the screen, again, what I'd like you to do is just answer where you believe your organisation is currently in this maturity model. Yeah, it was asked in the chat, but I also want to confirm we are sharing a lot of information very quickly, and the slides will definitely be sent out sort of following the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so do we have the results in yet? So are you sort of at that first end compliance? Are you emerging, starting to sort of do actions and processes around it? Are you starting to embrace it? Are you collaborating, so actively maybe recruiting neurodiverse individuals? Or are you really driving that value from neurodiversity and having a strong neurodiverse employer base and culture and leadership? Very interesting. Thank you very much for that. So I would say that, the majority of you, so 66% of you are in that sort of mandate mode before the transition. it's really nice to see that, you know, that 25% of you have started to embrace it and collaborate. And then actually, this is where we'd like to sort of move you to that all-inclusive and driving value. So we have the perfect audience for our seminars. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to hand over to Liz, who has some interesting statistics on why we might want to leverage neurodiversity in the workplace.
Hi, I feel like I'm a bit the voice of gloom here after all those positive things about why we should employ neurodiversity. So the first slide is figures from KPMG. They have been doing a survey every month for the last 24.5 years by going out to literally thousands of employers and recruitment companies, recording the number of vacancies, salary rises, the availability of staff. And this is the latest one. As you can see, vacancies fell quite sharply just in the middle of COVID, but they have been rising almost continuously since. It's the sharpest rise that they have ever recorded. It has leveled off a little bit recently, but in fact now it's steeply rising again. You can't really see because it's such a small graph, but that little uptick, it's starting to rise again. Similarly, staff availability, as you can see, it rose at the start of COVID, but there has been steady decline ever since. It started to level off a bit, but again, it is now starting to drop off again very shortly. And what this doesn't show is this is literally across the entire country, across every single industry that you can think of. The only industry that is not experiencing this massive skill shortage is the retail industry. Everywhere else, whatever you can think of, there is a massive skill shortage. So actually, a figure that I haven't got here, but ONS statistics show that vacancies are up by 114% compared to the same period last year. So, you know, that just shows you how short of staff we are. So next slide, please. And inevitably, the consequence of these staff shortages is massive salary inflation. Again, this is the steepest rise in salaries that KPMG have ever recorded over 24.5 years. And we actually did a survey at Christmas, and we could see that salaries within the insight profession were on average going up by 12%, but some of the increases were as high as 80%. I've never ever in all the years I've worked in recruitment seen salaries go up that much. And obviously this is not sustainable by business, and we can't continue to grow as an economy in the way that we want to with these skill shortages and with this massive wage inflation. So yeah, next slide. So on to slightly more positive things. Having said why we need to look at different pools of employment, specifically with neurodiversity, as Jack has said, one of the key things is that that people with neurodiverse traits have a lot of skills that employers want. Personally, within the insight profession, we analyse vast quantities of data, and as I was talking to Gillian and Jack earlier about, people that can process data, that have the retention, the processing advantages, can spot pattern irregularities, would be very useful within our profession. The next point is about talent retention. Obviously, if you are finding it very difficult to recruit staff, then it's very, very important that you retain the ones that you've got now. And all surveys show that people with neurodiverse traits, once employed, stay in a role for longer than the neurotypical. I didn't know that term existed until I started doing this. So that's another very good reason for taking them on. Next slide. The next slide is actually all about employee brand. Clearly, when there is this sort of shortage for talent, as an organisation, you have to think, why should somebody choose you over another organisation? And particularly I found for younger people that in organisations which are actively looking at this sort of thing are much more attractive to them. So PwC, for example, found that over 80% of participants said an employer's policy on diversity, equality and workforce inclusion is a very important factor when they're deciding which organisation to join. So, Linky, over to you.
Thanks very much, Liz. And in fact, just picking up from that point, I just wanted to very briefly touch on the push factors, which I think Liz has sort of signalled, in the sense that, I mean, I do interviews for staff and trainee interviews and that sort of thing. Well, 20 years ago, I was never asked what our diversity and inclusion policy was, and I am now asked that during an interview process. You're absolutely right, Liz. Particularly the younger generations do care, want to know, and want to join organisations which align with their values. They're much more value-based. And the other push factors that I was looking at, Liz also touched on sort of the real talent shortage, which will be a push factor to look at other pools of employment. But tenders, I'm sure that a lot of businesses will have experienced this, but when we are tendering to a corporate, our pitch documents and the pitch questions that they ask us about are increasingly include questions about diversity and inclusion, and that section is increasingly getting wider and wider. They want you to maintain those statistics. They want you to have particular policies in relation to recruitment and improving your diversity, and they want to align themselves with advisors or partners or suppliers or anyone else in their chain who aligns with those values. Indeed, 25 years ago, you wouldn't really hear about people talk about company values, and now it is absolutely on the agenda. And I've noticed that increasingly in the work that I do with city executives as well. ESG, I had never heard of ESG 20 years ago. I would never find somebody who rings me up and says, I work for one of the investment banks in ESG. It's environmental, social and governance. And yet over the last 18 months, 2 years, I would say, I'm now seeing city executives whose role is environmental, social governance. And increasingly, investors want these big investment banks to make assessments on products that are being created and companies that they're working with, corporate bonds and fixed income teams and that sort of thing. They all have to profile their investments by reference to ESG. And that, of course, includes diversity and inclusivity across the spectrum. And as Gillian said, neurodiversity is something that touches and cuts across all of the protected characteristics. Increasingly also, we're being asked about accreditations. B Corp is one that I picked out. A number of law firms have done it. We're in the process of applying for ours, and it is a sort of certification that you run sort of high standards of transparency, inclusivity, environmental governance, and integrity, all of those sort of fundamental features. And you need to be able to demonstrate that not only do you have a sort of, dusty old policy in a drawer somewhere that says we believe in diversity and inclusiveness, you have to actively demonstrate how you live those values and you're scored against it. And so it is a sort of kite mark of excellence, if you like. And one other thing that I came across researching for this was the United Nations Global, it's not impact, that's my appalling writing, which nobody could properly translate, its global compact. And it's 10 principles that the United Nations have developed, which sets a route map for setting out a company's value system and the principles-based approach to doing business. The sixth principle of the United Nations Global Compact is the elimination of all forms of discrimination in employment. And the aim of the UN Compact is to provide a universal language for corporate responsibility. Companies can sign up to it, and through that you receive guidance and training. So those are what I sort of regard as the push factors. Just to touch on, it's not only looking at the benefits, it's looking at, there are other organizations that you need to work with, be they clients, be they suppliers, who are all going to start pushing you more into that direction, and that can only be a good thing. I'm going to hand over back to Gillian briefly, who I think will conclude the sort of us talking to you part of the seminar, with a bit of a call to arms. And I also did just want to mention that at the end of the seminar, you'll get a short survey, which is an opportunity to again submit any further questions, which we will seek to address. But please do give some meaningful feedback about what did you find interesting, what would you like to hear more of, and we can adapt the future seminars that we're going to do to incorporate those ideas and things that you would like us to address. But I'll hand over to Gillian.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you both. So Liz obviously talked to us about the great resignation and shortages, and there's a great pool of talent out there that we can bring to the table. And Linky signposted us to some of the push factors and really spoke to companies' mission, values, and culture. So as a call to arms, Jack and I do run a profit for purpose. We really do want to make a difference. We are doing ongoing research within organizations where we do one-to-one sort of anonymous conversations, and they're almost like mentoring sessions with people within your organization that identify with neurodiversity or of a diagnosis. And we're offering, if you want to participate in this research, you get exclusive access to the findings and a summary of what people within your organization think for up to 5 participants, so 5 hours of interviewers and coaches. Please, you can scan using your phones, if this works, the QR code on the screen, but we will also circulate our emails after this as well. So we want to look at how teams understand how they've adapted their work processes, particularly during the pandemic as we move forward, to make inclusive environments for everybody and to really create a framework for continued effectiveness across remote and in-person sort of work environments. So please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. That concludes today. We did go slightly over our 30 minutes, but actually I'm quite impressed. It's only 37, so well done, team. And now we'd like to open up to questions.
I'm just looking at the our Q&A function. I don't know, do we have any questions yet that have been submitted? So we have one question asking about, we can see the advantages of employing a greater percentage of neurodiverse employees, but how do I attract talent like that? Jack and Gillian, I think that's part of your, the sort of the access to it as well. And Liz, how you deal with it in terms of your recruitment work. Can I hand over to you to deal with that question? How do you attract that sort of talent?
That is it. There are so many different things that you can do. That is a topic that we will be discussing later, because I could be talking about this solidly for at least half an hour.
Yeah.
But I mean, it starts with actually something that Gillian said, which is communication and making sure that you are an organisation where people feel comfortable to discuss their own neuro challenges and feel it's an organisation that will support them, will promote them. Once you get that open communication, it's then easier, I think, to attract the appropriate talent and all the things that you need to do in order to ensure that you assess fairly, onboard them correctly. Yeah, I won't go on anymore.
As you say, Liz, I think we're going to look at that specifically. We'll make sure that we, I mean, I think we've got a session sort of booked in for one of our sessions already, which you will focus on that sort of attracting that talent.
Absolutely. The only thing I'd like to add to that would be that, as opposed to just attracting, you really need to retain and motivate them as well. I heard a story this week. It was actually a well-known fast food chain actually wanted to attract neurodiverse individuals, and they actually sort of hired somebody that is autistic. What they did, though, unfortunately, they put her shifts in where people were coming out of school and going to McDonald's, and she was just constantly teased and shouted at. She actually asked them if she could move shifts, and they didn't move shifts, and she ended up leaving, and I don't think that she's ever going to try and find employment again. So I think when we look at that topic of attracting individuals, we will also sort of be talking about retaining and motivating. And I can see that there is a second question up there about the adapting the work environment to take full advantage of the special gifts. The team know that I'm passionate about this, but the way I look at it is that we are all neurodiverse. And by looking at people that are on those extremes, you are making it better for everyone. So if you take some of the feedback that we've had from our research, essentially, a lot of people have particular sensory needs. So one thing I would say with the working environment, and this goes to how they've been designed now, is give people choice about where they work, different types of spaces. So there might be a quiet room, a sensory room like a library. There might be a collaborative for social space, but put something that's slightly quieter off of that social space. So the people that suffer from extra perceptory sensory around hearing, and hearing acoustics affects all of us. I know I find it difficult in noisy bars now, but I like to be looking at lots of people, not necessarily immersed in that environment. So I would say there are the ways that we could actually advise you around adapting the working environment to make it better for everyone. And again, I think this will be part of another session that picks up from some of our research. And
the other, sorry, Gillian, the other thing that I was very struck by when we were discussing these things was it's also processes, isn't it? In the sense that people learn very differently, and although we're sort of focusing on the sort of 1 in 7 who are particularly disadvantaged, the sort of neurodiverse as opposed to the neurotypical, as you said at the start, actually nobody's the same and everybody learns very differently. And it makes me think, for instance, about our training that we do as a firm. We sort of roll out Windows 10 or whatever, and we sort of say, please attend this training to sort of learn. But actually people learn very differently, and some people do like pictures, some people like words, some people. So it's made me sort of think much more broadly about the sort of different way that people learn, and other policies and procedures that organization have, as well as the working environment.
And to back that up, Linky, I think that is the beauty of inclusivity, that if you tackle some of the harder issues within diversity, actually the things that come out of it apply to the whole workforce and actually benefit the whole workforce. So this shouldn't be thought of as, oh, well, we're just concentrating really on this one area. It's easier to start by concentrating on one area, but actually the benefits are for everyone.
Yeah. And I see there's a question from another contributor as well, who asked what tools and approaches are there available to help ensure both recruitment and appraisal assessments fair to neurodiverse individuals. Liz, when we do the recruitment element, I'm sure that you'll touch on that, but appraisal assessments, for me, I think the absolute key is to have SMART objectives. So they have to be specific, memorable, achievable. I can't remember what the R is, and timely, and it's
realistic. I think
reactive. That's it. And it's about setting absolutely, sort of clear and specific SMART objectives for that particular individual, neurodiverse individual, in their role. And as long as you have those SMART objectives, you can then make a proper assessment against them. It's the sort of, the appraisals that tend to annoy me are the sort of rather, wishy-washy. Well, how have you done this year? I think that you're not as proactive. What does that mean? Why do I have to do that? I'm a data inputter. It's finding the right SMART objectives for the role.
Yeah, I mean, again, I could talk for ages on this, but Julian brought up one of the things that is useful is some sort of psychometric testing, or in what Julian mentioned is the mind mapping. There are other ways of assessing people beyond interviewing. We had an interesting example recently where an organisation wanted to consider somebody who was badly dyslexic. And what they did is they sent them the questions in advance, because they knew that this individual would be stressed by an exam situation. And just as with exams where you give dyslexics longer, they decided it was better to give her the questions in advance and give her a fairer chance to do really well. And she did do very well, and she got the job. So, there are all sorts of things. But again, I won't bore you, because that's yeah, I could talk forever, and I've realised we're out of time.
Yeah, well, I also just, apologies, Jack. I think I sort of cut across you. Do chip in.
The thing that I was going to say, and Liz highlighted something about the psychometric testing as well. Sometimes, because I applied for a role a while ago, and there was testing involved with that, and sometimes the questions were obscure, and I kind of didn't grasp it or understand it. So as we were talking about the spectrum of neurodiversity, it's very important to kind of consider that the questions are tailored, I think, for all to be able to answer, because some of these obscure questions, like in some scenarios that you don't really know of, it is very difficult, I think.
Even for neurotypical people.
Yeah.
Well, I had a sort of real life example of that, where a member of my family who's at university was doing a sort of interim test, and it was a multiple choice, and this individual is particularly dyslexic and has additional time and that sort of thing. But one of the first question was, which of the following statements is true? And is able to answer that. And then the next question was, which of the following statements is not true? And of course, dyslexic and under pressure, he didn't identify the not true. And what he was saying is, if they use the word false, it's particularly different, or it's sufficiently different to him, have a greater likelihood of him picking out that difference. Which it never occurred to me, but it's such a simple fix, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're sort of right up against our time, and thank you so much for all of our speakers. We'll be doing it all again on the 11th of April. No, not the 11th of April. I think it's the 11th of May. Sorry, I've got the date wrong. I've just noticed on my slide for our second session. Many apologies. We will send out a reminder. And we will look then at the barriers to entry and promotion within the workplace for neurodiverse staff. But thank you so much to all of you attending, and we very much hope you'll be with us on the 11th of May. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.